Hey everyone, welcome to part 109 of my Pokemon game series in Unity. So in this video, we'll refactor the action selection and move selection states of the battle to use the StateStack architecture. So in the previous video, we refactored the battle state itself, but the battle state has lots of substates under it, right? So we also have to refactor the substate by creating another state machine in the battle system. So we look at how to implement that in this video. So we have lots of states in battle, but let's start by refactoring a simple state like the action selection, and then we'll move on to the more complex ones. So to refactor the action selection state, first we have to refactor the action selection UI to use the generic selector. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside scripts, in the battle folder, I'll create a new folder called UI, and in here, I'll create a script called action selection UI. Okay, so let me get rid of the default code, and this class is going to inherit the selection UI class. All right, and it's going to be a selection UI of text slot. So next we have to call the set items function of the selection UI and set the list of action slots into it. So since we only have a fixed number of battle actions, we can just set it from the start function. All right, so I'll call the set items from the start function, and we have to pass a list of text slot to it. So we can get that by calling get components in children. Okay, and I'll just use a toList function to convert it into a list. All right, and next, since the action selection is a grid selection, we also have to set that by calling the set selection settings function. And for the selection type, I'll pass grid, and for the grid width, I'll pass 2. All right, so this is all we have to do in the action selection UI. So let's go to Unity and set up the action selection UI. So the action selection UI is under the dialog box of the battle canvas. Okay, and here we have 4 actions. So to each action, we have to add the text slot component. So let me select all the 4 action text and add a text slot component to it. All right, and then to each text slot, we have to pass the text. So we can either drag and drop the text like this, or we can just drag and drop the whole game object. Both will work. Okay, so now all our action text has text slot script attached to it. So next, to the action selector, let's go ahead and attach the action selection UI class. All right, so now our action selection UI is set up to use the generic selector. So next, let's go ahead and create the action selection state. So inside the battle folder, I'll create another folder to hold all the states. And in here, I'll create a new script called action selection state. Okay, so this is going to be a state of battle system. All right, so in this state, first we need a reference to the action selection UI. So let me create a serialized field variable for that. All right, and then in the enter function, we can go ahead and enable the action selection UI. All right. Let me just rename this to selection UI to keep things short. That looks better. So in the enter function, first we need to enable the action selection UI, and then we need to subscribe to the on selected event. Okay. So let me create a function for that. All right. So this function will take an integer parameter for the selection. And from this function, we have to go to different states based on the selection of the user. But we'll be implementing that later since we don't have the other states now. Okay. So let me go ahead and attach the function to the on selected event. Okay. And then from the exit function, we can do the opposite of what we did in the enter function. So let me just copy this and I'll disable the selection UI and I'll unsubscribe from the on selected function. Okay. So in the action selection state, we don't have to subscribe to the on back function because in a battle, we can't really go back from the action selection state, right? We have to pick an action for the battle to continue. So we don't have to subscribe to the on back event. All right. So next, I'll override the execute function. And from here, we just have to call selection UI.handle update. So next, we also have to cache the reference to the battle system from the enter function. So let me do that. All right. And finally, we also want to make this state a singleton so that we can access it from other classes. So let me create a public static reference of it. Okay. And then in the awake function, we can assign the reference. All right, so this is all we have to do in the action selection state for now. So next, let's try to run the state from the battle system. So for that, we have to create another state machine in the battle system. So as I mentioned before, it's going to be like a sub-state machine. The main state machine will be in the game controller. And when the state is battle, then we'll run another sub-state machine in the battle system. Okay. So here in the battle system script, I'll create another state machine. All right, so we have to import the cd utils.state machine namespace. So this is going to be a state machine of the battle system. All right. And let's initialize the state machine when we start a battle. So let's do it from inside the setup battle function. Okay, so when we call the state machine constructor, we also have to pass the owner, which is the battle system itself. So we can pass the this keyword. Okay. So next, at the start of the battle, we have to set the state of the state machine to the action selection state that we just created. So until now, we were doing it by setting the state enum. But now, instead of doing that, we have to set the state to the state machine. So I'll call state machine.change state. And for the state, I'll pass the action selection state. Okay. And by the way, note that when we are setting the action selection state, we are also showing a dialog choose action to convey that to the player. So we should also do that from the enter function of the action selection state. So let me just copy this line and paste it into the enter function. Okay. But the problem is the dialog box is a private field in the battle system class. So we have to expose it using a property. So down here, let me create a property to expose it. All right. And now from the action selection state, we can just use the property. Okay. So now when the game starts, we'll change the state of the state machine to action selection. So next, from the handle update function of the battle system, we have to call state machine dot execute. Okay, so this will execute the action selection state or the state that is currently set in the state machine. So we don't need this code anymore where we're calling the handle action selection function. So let me just get rid of that. And this function is not being used anymore. We can remove it if we want, but I'm not going to remove it now because it might be useful to refer things like how we handled the selection and all that. So I'll be removing it once the refactor is complete. Okay. So now let's go to Unity and let's attach the action selection state to the battle system. Okay, so we also have to assign the action selection UI here. So let me drag and drop it over here. All right. And now we can try testing it. Okay. So yeah, you can see that the action selection is working, and it is working by using a state machine and not the enum state. Okay. So next, let's go ahead and refactor the MoveSelection state. So when we select fight from here, we have to go to the MoveSelection state, right? So before we create the MoveSelection state, we have to first refactor the MoveSelection UI to use the generic selector. So in the UI folder, I'll create a new script for the MoveSelection UI. Okay, but this is showing me an error. So this is because we have already defined another class called MoveSelection UI. So that was a class that we defined for selecting the move to forget, right? We did it in one of the previous videos. So this is the class. So what we can do is we can rename this class to something else. So I'll just call it move to forget selection, just to be more clear. Okay. And I'll change this one to MoveSelection UI itself. All right. So that should fix the error. But we also want to rename the file because if the name of the file and the class is different, it can cause problems. So we also want to rename the file to move to forget selection. Okay. So now we don't have the error anymore. And by the way, we can also move this into our UI folder since it's an UI. And now we can go ahead and implement the MoveSelection UI. Okay. So this is going to be a selection UI of text slot. All right. And the moves that we want to show here will always be different based on the current Pokemon. So we can't just set it from the start function. So instead, I'll create a public function called setMoves, and this will take a list of move. Okay, and from here we can call setItems and pass the text slots for the move. So in case of MoveSelection UI, I'll get the text slot by assigning it into a serialized field. Okay, so the reason why I'm doing this instead of getting it with the get components and children is because this function will be called multiple times. So getting the move text again and again by calling get components and children will not be that efficient. Okay, but in the case of action selection, since we are calling it from start, this will only be called once, and that's fine. But calling it multiple times won't be efficient. So I'll just get it like this. Okay, so we need to pass the move text into the setItems function, and we don't want to pass all the move text. Instead, we only want to pass them based on the number of moves that was passed to us. Okay, so for example, if only 3 moves were passed, then we only want to pass 3 move text to the setItems function, right? So here I'll just use a take function with which we can pass a number and get that many number of items from the list. So if I pass 3, I'll get 3 items on the list. If I pass 2, I'll get 2 items. So here we want to pass moves.count for the number because we want to select the move text based on the number of moves. Okay, and finally I'll just convert it to a list by calling toList function. All right, so this will set up the move text for selection. And next, we also need to set the names of the move to the move text. So I believe we have already wrote the code for that in the battle dialog box. So here we had a function called set move names. So we can actually copy the same code and paste it over here. But here we have an error because here the move text is not a text, but it's a text slot, right? We made it a text slot because we also wanted to handle things like color change when the selection changes. All right. So we can't just set the text like this. So what I'll do is in the text slot, I'll create another function called setText, and this will take a string, and we'll set that to the text that we have in the text slot. Okay, so now from here we can just call the setText function and set the name of the move. So here if the number of moves is less than 4, then we'll just set this for the rest of the move text. Okay, so this will handle the move selection for us. But we have to do one more thing. Whenever a move is selected, we also have to show its PP and type, right? So we can do that by overriding the update selection in UI function of the selection UI. Okay, and then from here we can go ahead and set the PP and type of the move. So to set that, first we have to get a reference to the text for showing the PP and type. So let me create 2 serialized field variables to get the PP and type text. And then whenever the move selection changes, we can go ahead and change the PP and type in the text. So again, we have already written the code for this in the battle dialog box. So yeah, we can just copy this code and paste it into our MoveSelection UI. All right. So here we don't have a reference to the selected move. That's why we are having this error. But we have the reference to the selected index, right? In the selection UI, we have an integer variable that will give us a selected index. So to get the move from it, we'll have to cache the moves list. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, I'll cache the moves list from here. And now we can get the move using the selection index. Okay, so this is all you have to do in the MoveSelection UI script. So now we can go to Unity and set up the MoveSelection UI. So for each move text, we have to add the text slot. Okay, and for each text slot, we have to assign the text. All right, that's done. And to the move selector, we have to attach the MoveSelection UI script, and then we have to assign the list of move text here, and we also have to assign the PP and type text. So let me go ahead and assign those. Okay, so we have refactored the MoveSelection UI to use generic selector. So next, let's go ahead and create the MoveSelection state. So inside the states folder, I'll create a new script called MoveSelection state. Okay, so this is going to be a state of battle system. All right, and in this state, first we need a reference to the MoveSelection UI. So let me create a serialized field variable for that. Okay, and then in the enter function, we can go ahead and enable selection UI. Okay, and next we have to subscribe to the events of the selection UI. So in this case, we have to subscribe to both the events. So let me create functions for that. So first I'll create a function for the on selected event. All right, and then I'll also create a function for the on back event. So we'll be implementing these functions later. All right, so let me go ahead and attach the functions to the event. All right, so next in the exit function, we can do the opposite of what we did in the enter function. All right, so we can go ahead and disable the MoveSelection UI, and we can unsubscribe from the events. Okay, and next from the execute function, we can go ahead and call selection UI dot handle update. Okay, so next from the MoveSelection state, we also have to enable the UI for showing PP and move type, right? So this is a separate game object. So we have to get a reference to it and enable it. So here I'll get a reference to the move details game object. Okay. And I'll enable it from the enter function. And I'll disable it from the exit function. Okay. So next, during the move selection, we should also disable the dialog box in the battle because move selection happens on top of the dialog box. So we can go ahead and disable the dialog box. But first, let me cache the reference to the battle system. Okay. And now we can disable the dialog box from the enter function. And then we can go ahead and enable it back from the exit function. Okay. So next, every time we enter the move selection state, we also have to set the moves in our move selection UI by calling the set moves function that we created. So what I'll do is I'll create an input for the move selection state. So we'll have a list of moves as the input. Okay. And then from the enter function, we have to call the set moves function and set the moves. All right. So this is all you have to do in the move selection state. So now we can write the code for switching to the move selection state. So that will be done from the action selection state, right? So when an action is selected, we can check if the selection is equal to 0. And if it's 0, then that means fight was selected. So in that case, we want to switch to the move selection state, right? So from here, I'll call battle system.stateMachine.change state function. And by the way, here I'm using change state instead of push because if we use push, then the action selection state won't exit. Okay, so that means its UI will still be enabled and will also be subscribed to the events of the selection UI. So we don't want that in this case when you're switching to the move selection state. So I'm going to use the change state function instead of push. Okay, so here I'll pass move selection state. All right, and we have forgotten to make the move selection state a singleton. So let me create a public static instance and make it a singleton. Okay, so now it's a singleton and we can switch to it. And by the way, before we switch to the move selection state, we also have to set its input, right? So from here, we have to set the moves that we want to show in the move selection UI. So basically, we have to set the moves of the player's current Pokemon, right? So we have the player's current Pokemon in the player unit field of the battle system, but this is a private field. So we have to create a property to expose it. Okay. So let me create a public property to expose the player unit. And while we are here, let's also expose the enemy unit because we need that for sure when we are implementing the run turn state. Okay, so now from here we can set the moves of the move selection state as the moves of the player's current Pokemon. So we can get that from the player unit dot Pokemon dot moves. Okay, so this will set the move that we want to show in the move selection UI, and then we'll change the state to the move selection state. Okay, so next from the move selection state, if the player presses back, then we want to change back to the action selection. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so this is all we have to do for the move selection. So now let's go to Unity, and first we need to attach the move selection state to the battle system. Okay, and here we have to assign the move selection UI and the move details game object. And by the way, in the battle system, we can go ahead and remove the handle move selection call because it will be handled from the state machine itself. Okay, so I'll remove this whole if condition, and now we can go to Unity and see if the move selection is working. Okay, let me start a battle. All right, so it looks like we have an issue. So this is because in the move selection state, we are disabling the whole dialog box game object, but instead we only want to disable the move text by calling this function. All right, so let's go ahead and change that. So here I'll call battle dialog box dot enable dialog text function. Okay, let me also do that in the exit. Okay, and by the way, there is also something I missed to do in the move selection UI. So the move selection is a grid selection, right? So we have to set that by calling the set selection settings function. So I'll just call it from the start and set the selection type to grid and the grid width to 2. All right. So now hopefully all the issues should be fixed. So let's go to Unity and test. All right. Let me go ahead and start a battle. All right. So now if I go to the move selection state, you can see that selecting moves and showing the move details is working. So we have refactored the action selection and move selection state of the battle to use the StateStack Architecture and generic selector. So I'll stop the video here, and in the next video we'll refactor the run turn state. So before you leave, make sure to leave a like on the video and consider subscribing to our channel. That will really help me out. So I'll see you in the next video.